HMS Phoebe was one of 4 frigates that the Admiralty ordered on May 24, 1794. The contract for the first ship was placed and the keel was laid in June 1794. She was named HMS Phoebe on February 26, 1795, and was launched on September 24, 1795 at Deptford Wharf on the Thames River. She was then moved to Deptford Dockyard, where she was completed on December 23, 1795. HMS Phoebe was first commissioned in October 1795 under Captain Robert Barlow for the Irish coast and Edward Pelow's squadron. On January 10, 1797, after an 8-hour chase, she captured the 16-gun Atlante under the command of Lieutenant Dordelin off the Isles of Sicily. In 1797, HMS Phoebe was off Brest, France, as part of an inshore squadron of frigates under Sir Edward Pellow. The squadron included HMS Amazon, HMS Revolutionnaire, and the hired armed lugger Duke of York. On December 22, 1797, HMS Phoebe captured the French 36-gun Neredi. HMS Phoebe lost 3 men killed and 10 wounded. Neredi lost 20 men killed and 55 wounded. In 1847, the Admiralty awarded the Navy General Service Medal with clasps Phoebe 21st December 1797 to all the remaining members of her crew who had participated in the action. On March 5th, Phoebe captured the privateer Haroux in the English Channel off Bordeaux, France. Haroux had intended to cruise the West Indies. Instead, she arrived at Plymouth, Devon, England on March 25th. Haroux mistook HMS Phoebe for an East Indiaman ship and approached her. Haroux did not discover her mistake until she had arrived within musket shot. Haroux fired on HMS Phoebe in an act of temerity to be regretted. Her hope was that well-directed fire would disable Phoebe's mast, rigging, and sails, and therefore enable her to escape. Phoebe returned fire, and Haroux was forced to strike her colors. Phoebe had 3 seamen killed or mortally wounded, and 3 slightly wounded. Haroux had 18 men killed and 25 men wounded, most of whom lost limbs. The British took her into service as HMS Haroux. On February 19, 1801, about 6 miles east of Gibraltar, HMS Phoebe sighted a French ship off Ceuta, Spain, also sailing eastward. Captain Barlow chased the French vessel for 2.5 hours before he could bring her to a close action. After about 2 hours, the French vessel struck her colors. She had 5 feet of water in her hold and was almost a wreck. Phoebe's fire had dismounted her guns and left her deck strewn with hundreds of casualties. It turned out that the ship was actually the French frigate Africaine of 26 18-pounders and 18 9-pounders. She had a crew of 315 men, but also was ferrying 400 troops to reinforce the French invasion force in Egypt. The British took Africaine into service under her existing name. In 1802, Captain the Honorable Thomas Bladen Capel recommissioned HMS Phoebe in September. She then sailed for the Mediterranean on the 28th of September. On June 13th, HMS Phoebe and HMS Amazon made ready to engage 2 French frigates anchored under the guns of the northmost fort of Toulon, France. The fort fired at HMS Phoebe, but she was out of range. When the French fleet sortied, the British vessels rejoined their squadron. However, the French fleet returned to port without engaging. HMS Victory was passing the island of Toro on April 4, 1805, when HMS Phoebe brought the news that the French fleet under Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve had escaped from Toulon, France. While Admiral Horatio Nelson made for Sicily to see if the French were heading for Egypt, Villeneuve entered Cadiz, Spain, to link up with the Spanish fleet. Then, while Admiral Nelson was pursuing the French fleet from Toulon to the West Indies, Captain Capel in HMS Phoebe was in charge of a small squadron of 5 frigates and 2 bomb vessels with the mission of covering Sicily, Sardinia, and the route to Egypt. HMS Phoebe joined the blockade of Cadiz, Spain later in the summer. The arrival of the additional frigates HMS Phoebe, HMS Naid, HMS Sirius, HMS Juno, and HMS Niger off Cadiz, Spain allowed Admiral Nelson to detach them to disrupt local shipping supplying provisions for the Franco-Spanish combined fleet in Cadiz. During the subsequent Battle of Trafalgar, HMS Phoebe relayed Admiral Nelson's signals to the rest of the fleet and remained close to the action, although she did not actually engage the enemy. On August 3, 1811, HMS Phoebe joined the fleet involved in the invasion of Java, an island of Indonesia. Lieutenant General Sir Samuel Achmuty was the military commander-in-chief, and Rear Admiral Robert Stopford was the naval commander-in-chief. On August 31st, Rear Admiral Stopford detached the frigates HMS Nisus, HMS President, and HMS Phoebe and a sloop Hesper to take Cirebon, Java, a seaport about 35 leagues east of the capital, Batavia. They arrived at dark on the 3rd of September, and the fort surrendered the next morning without a shot being fired. On September 11th, at 4 a.m., HMS Nisus and HMS Phoebe weighed and steered for Tegal, a port about 20 or 25 leagues farther to the east. The next day, HMS Phoebe arrived off the harbor. Together with a landing party of seamen, marines, and some sepoys, Captain Hilliard took quiet possession of the fort and public stores. HMS Phoebe, HMS Nisus, HMS President, and HMS Harpy joined Rear Admiral Stopford with HMS Lion and LR Gipion on September 14th. The next day they sailed for Surabaya, Java. On September 17th, they anchored off Ledeo on the Java shore, where 3 transports with 450 men joined them. There they learned that the Dutch and French had surrendered the day before. On April 9th, 1812, HMS Phoebe sailed with a convoy for Quebec, province of Lower Canada. She returned to Deal, Kent, England on August 2nd. On September 30th, she was in Plymouth, Devon, England, having brought dispatches from Halifax, Nova Scotia, province of Upper Canada. She then underwent a refit. In late December 1812, HMS Phoebe captured 2 American schooners. A few days later, HMS Phoebe was sailing off the Azores, Portugal, in the company of the 74-gun third-rate HMS Elephant under the command of Francis Austin, together with HMS Hermes. On December 27th, they captured the American privateer schooner Swordfish of Gloucester, Massachusetts, USA. Swordfish was 16 days out of Boston and had a crew of 82 men and originally 12 6-pounder guns. However, she had thrown 10 overboard during the chase, which took 11 hours and covered more than 100 miles. On March 18th, 1813, HMS Phoebe left Portsmouth, Hampshire, England, with a convoy for Brazil and the East Indies. On July 6, HMS Phoebe, the sloop of war HMS Cherub, and the HMS Raccoon sailed for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Kingdom of Portugal, and the Algarves, under Cape Horn to the Juan Ferdinand Islands, Kingdom of Chile. There, HMS Raccoon continued on to the fur trading outpost of Fort Asteria in the unclaimed territory of the Northeast. HMS Phoebe and HMS Cherub remained to search for the 36-gun USS Essex. Captain Hilliard was under orders to capture the USS Essex at all costs. On February 8, 1814, HMS Phoebe and HMS Cherub arrived at Valparaiso, Kingdom of Chile, a neutral port, where USS Essex and her prizes were anchored. Having trapped the USS Essex in the harbor, Captain Hilliard waited 6 weeks for her to come out and thwarted all the efforts of her captain to escape. Eventually, on March 28th, Captain Porter attempted to break out of the harbor. A squall took off his main toppost and he attempted to return to harbor, but HMS Phoebe and Cherub drove USS Essex into a nearby bay and defeated her in a short engagement. In the engagement with the USS Essex, HMS Phoebe had 4 men killed, including her first lieutenant, and 7 men were wounded. HMS Cherub had 1 killed and 3 wounded, including her captain. The British reported that USS Essex had 24 men killed and 45 wounded, though the Americans reported higher casualties. On May 31st, the Admiralty promoted Lieutenant Person to commander and repaired the Essex, taking her into service as HMS Essex. HMS Phoebe was paid off in 1814 and laid up at Plymouth, Devon, England, in August 1815. HMS Phoebe was eventually sold for breaking up to Joshua Crystal for 1,750 British pounds on May 25, 1841.